Okay, welcome to the fourth and final day. It's blown by. So we opened up the conference with Doreen Duncan speaking, and the fourth day here is going to open up with Ken Duncan speaking. And my colleague Maurice Crandall will be introducing Ken and moderating the conversation after Ken speaks. And I hope we get to hear a little bit about your book, because I think it'll fit nicely with what I anticipate the conversation, some of the directions of the conversation. And I also want to let the in-person audience know that there will be hoop dancing in the Galvin Plaza, just outside this building. I can give you directions. That'll be at noon, and that will be with Yellowbird Productions and Yellowbird Indian dancers, and look forward to that. But once again, restrooms out that way to the left or the right. Got caffeine, hydration station out there with some snacks. And no further ado, I'll hand it over to my colleague Maurice Crandall to introduce Ken, and section's yours.
Thank you all for being here this morning. Appreciate seeing you bright and early. My name is Maurice Crandall. I'm an associate professor in history here at ASU. I'm also a member of the Apache Nation of Camp Verde, Arizona, which is sort of a sister tribe to San Carlos. Lots of common friends and relations across those two. And I'm going to introduce Ken today with his bio. Ken Duncan Sr. is a Native American from the Apache tribe, born on the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation in eastern Arizona. He's an accomplished Native American Apache cultural teacher, singer, flute player, artist, and storyteller. He's a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my auntie also went. Oh, really? Yeah. Mr. Duncan is the founder and director of a family business, Yellowbird Productions. In 2021, Ken completed ASU Gamage Teaching Artist Program. He's currently a cultural education consultant for the San Carlos Unified School District. Among his many accomplishments, Ken has lectured on American Indian culture across the United States and throughout the world, including the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in New York and in Washington, D.C. Ken has served as a Native American consultant to the U.S. State Department and the Department of Defense on numerous foreign goodwill tours to U.S. embassies and consulates in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Central, and South America. Truly a globetrotter. In 2004, the Governor's Office of Arizona recognized Yellowbird as the Culture Keepers of Arizona. Also in 2015, they were awarded with the Arizona American Indian Excellence in Leadership Award, Native American Business of the Year. Ken credits his cultural knowledge to his grandparents, who raised him in the traditional Apache upbringing. Ken's grandmother shared Apache stories, songs, and crafts, and his grandfather taught him Apache philosophy and religion. His grandparents used Apache culture as teaching tools of life's lessons to him and his siblings. Carrying on what he was taught, Ken uses creative storytelling to engage, inspire, and educate. A highlight he appreciates most is the opportunity to keep traditions alive by sharing with both Native American and non-Native American audiences. Would you please join me in welcoming Ken Duncan?
Yeah, she Ken Duncan Sr. was not its also seven is the bunch tea. Good morning, my name is Ken Duncan Sr. I am of the Slender Mountain clan from the White Mountain Apache tribe, my mother's clan. And I also come from the Surrounded by Rocks clan from the Aravaipa people of my father's heritage. We were playing outside, my sister, my little sister, my two little brothers, and I. As little kids do, we were lost in having so much fun at grandmother's house where we were raised. My mother, at 27 years old, died in a gas explosion one morning as she was trying to light the stove to prepare breakfast for my father. And my father, having just returned from the Korean War not too long ago, decided he could not raise 4 young children, the youngest one of us still strapped in a cradle board at 9 months old. He turned us over to my grandmother and my grandfather, his parents. So we were playing outside grandmother's house about 4:30, 5 o'clock. All of a sudden, we heard a honk. 2 honks. Doot, doot. We looked up. The 4 of us, kids, counted. 1, 2, 3. Doot. We all took a deep breath and we stood up. And we looked at one another. And we looked at the house. And Grandma came out and says, hide, hide. Hurry, hide now, go. You know what to run, run, run. And quickly we all ran towards the river. Grandmother's house was maybe 200 yards from the bluff where the river flowed below. There were the thickets of willows and cottonwood trees. We ran down the dirt path. I waited for my sister to catch up with us. And we all went down and we ran upstream and we hid underneath some willow trees, sitting there quietly. We could hear ourselves breathing. And my little brother was scared, so my sister calmed him down. While we were gone, hiding below, my grandmother carefully walked out around the house. And there she saw the tribal police walking up, 2 of them. And behind her was a social worker, a blonde white lady with her glasses on and her 3-piece dress slacks that she always wore. They always tried to take us, the social workers, from off the reservation. They thought my grandmother was not able to take care of 4 young children, that it was better for 2 families here in Phoenix to take care of us, one in Glendale and one in Tempe. And the other 2 were supposed to be taken to 2 separate families in Tucson. But my grandmother fought. And all those years, my grandmother hid us whenever the social workers came with the tribal police. But she made a deal with the tribal police. Can you give me a signal to give the children time to run away? And so the tribal police said, we'll honk 2 times, then count to 3. And if we honk the 3rd time, that means the social worker is with us. So they looked all over the house. They couldn't find us. And they left, as they had done many, many times before. I was maybe 9 years old at the time. I was the oldest. And so I had a boogie woman with me all my life. She always tried to take us, but my grandmother always hid us. And so that is my life story as a little boy. My grandmother is who I owe pretty much everything to and what I do today. I am proud of who I am. I am not intimidated by anyone. I don't know what she did to teach me, but no matter where you are in the world, at a 5-star resort in an elevator, at a corporate office somewhere, an elevator, being stuck with suits, businessmen, it's all quiet. I'm the one that starts the conversation. I'm the one that cracks the joke. It doesn't matter who I'm with. To me, they're only people. And I thank my grandmother for making me feel that way. Although many of my fellow Apaches were taken off the reservation, and when they came back, they were completely different people as adults. They didn't speak the language. They didn't know anything about the colors of the Apache. They had forgotten that to the east is the color black. They had forgotten or were never taught that the color turquoise is to the south. They had forgotten that the color to the west is yellow. And they had no idea that the color white was to the north. And they had no idea why we have these colors. In the beginning of time, the Creator came from out of darkness, from this part of the universe, from total darkness, from blackness, he came. And he said, in this place, I will make life. So on the first day, he came out of darkness and created life out of nothing. And then on the second day, he looked at that sphere that he had made with canyons and mountains and valleys and plains. He planted trees and grass, all the greenery. And he enveloped that sphere with air. And then it was covered with color blue. When the blue mixes with the green, it creates turquoise. On the second day, he created the blue sky and all the greenery. Then on the third day, he created all living things from the smallest microorganisms to the largest whale. Even man was among them. He told all life that he had created to stand all together and face the east. And as they stood there, he bathed them with the first warming rays of the sun, the yellow sun. And so the color yellow was given to the third day to the west. Then on the final day, he said, I've given you breath, I've given you warmth, but you need your spirits. So he cupped his hands 4 times, and he blew into his hands, and he released his breath, and out came white clouds. As long as the white clouds surround the sphere, life will always exist, he said. As soon as people, animals, birds, fish, all life form, plants and trees started breathing in his breath, they received their spiritual part of themselves. And so to the north became the color of the white clouds, white. These Apaches that were taken off the reservation by social workers forcibly did not know this story until I told them later on in years when they came to my class. And so I thank my grandmother in making me who I am to be Apache. Apache is my first language. When I first met my wife there, 17 years old, at a boarding school, she knew I was Apache, and she heard of Apaches, but she's from North Dakota, far, far away from Arizona. And so she said, I've heard of Apaches. You said you speak Apache. She said, could you speak it to me? So that evening, she said, let's go for a walk. And she said, can you tell me about the stars? Can you tell me about the moon? But only in Apache. So as 2 17-year-olds, we walked hand in hand, and I spoke to her in Apache. And she listened. Although she didn't have any idea what I was saying, she was smiling all that time. And as I looked at her, I knew that I had won the game. And I said a soft thank you to my grandmother. Thank you, grandmother, for teaching me Apache. I think I'm just starting to date this young girl here. And she said at the end, she goes, Apache sounds like French. And I said, oui. True story. But my life is all based on what my grandparents taught me. And so we're talking about genocide, but I'm talking about what happens to a child when he is spared those atrocities, when he's allowed to still be in the same environment, be raised by the same people that the Creator gave him to be raised by. And so that is my point I'm trying to make today. My grandfather was the head medicine man for a faction of the Apache religion that they called the Holy Ground movement. They would make huge sand paintings about the size of this room, maybe a little bit larger. They would start in the middle and it would go clockwise and make huge sand paintings. And I was taught as a little boy where to look for all the pigmentations that made the sand paintings. And I was taught the different symbols to make the sand paintings. And so my grandfather taught me because I was the oldest and I was his apprentice. My son wants to write a book called The Medicine Man's Apprentice about me. So I don't know if he'll ever do that, but I owe a lot to my grandfather too. One time he took me out and smoothed out sand between our house and where the shed was, where he kept all of his tools that he used to be a medicine man, to be a healer. He says, Kenny, sit down here. I want to show you something. About 11 o'clock that morning, he knelt down. He said, come down here. So I knelt next to him, took his hand, and he just smoothed it out, smoothed the sand out. And he said, this means, this is our Apache children's prayer. Ni'awazana. This is when earth was made. Ya'awazana. When the sky was made. Yana. On the first day, all of life was made holy. He would draw the symbols for each prayer. It was like hieroglyphics. He scribbled it out with his finger in the sand. He said, remember that, recite that. And to this day, I still remember my Apache children's prayer. I can still see his fingers writing it in the sand for me to learn. And so my grandfather taught me the ways of Apache medicine man when I was a little boy. And so I'm different than most other Apache boys my age. Most of them played basketball. They were in Boy Scouts. They were in 4-H. If you know, remember what 4-H is, back then I'm dating myself here. 4-H. And that's like farm science kind of stuff. And some people played football. But me, I wasn't allowed to play those things. I had a job to do, and that was to help my grandfather. And so that was the beginning of my life. I started realizing that there's a lot of history among my people, Apache. And so I started doing a lot of research on my own. I started asking people questions. I started reading a lot of books. I'm going to read his book for sure. I'm an avid reader. Sometimes my wife used to say, Ken, where are you? You've been gone for 3 hours. And I would be at the library reading this book, that book, this book. I love to read. When I first visited my wife's family in North Dakota, I was just 17 years old. We were all sitting in the living room, just visiting, and all of a sudden there was a shelf full of encyclopedias, 2 rows of it. And I thought, oh, encyclopedias. So I took one out and I cracked it open, and it was obvious no one had ever opened those books before. They were still really stiff. I don't know how long they were sitting there. I opened it and I started. It didn't matter where I opened it. I just started reading. And then I flipped through it and I got an idea of what that letter, encyclopedia, was important to me. And then I put it back in and I And then later on, she told me, she said, you know, my dad was impressed with you because you're the only one that read his encyclopedia. But I love to read. And so I started doing a lot of research. And then I realized that there was a man called Geronimo that was Apache. And this man, they call him Guyafe, the one who yawns. For me, you say one who yawns is not a you know. That's what it means. But Guyafe, I can't place that. But it must be true. It must be from his clan. But Geronimo, he was not a chief. He was a war chief at times, but at the most, he was a war chief. But he was immediately back to being a medicine man after that. But he never was a chief. That's why when you see him in historical pictures, he's sitting on a horse with all the warriors on the ground, but there's one other person sitting next to him on a horse, and that's Naichi. That's Cochise's youngest son. He was the chief of the Apaches, of the Chiricahua people. So he could not do anything without Naichi telling the people what to do. So that's why there's always two people on horseback in those black and white pictures from C.S. Fly's photo collection. But Geronimo realized that a lot of these Apache chiefs from the time we made contact with the Spanish in the early 1600s, all the way up to the mid 1800s, the Spanish made treaties with the Apaches. They all were broken. Apaches made treaties with the Mexicans. They were all broken. And the Apaches made treaties with the white Americans, and they were all broken. So in Geronimo's eyes, treaties meant nothing. And so that's why this warrior took to the warpath. And he took a few warriors with him, not many at all. And so when Geronimo was finally coaxed to surrender, he had a handful of warriors with him. But General Miles ordered that they find scouts that were related to his warriors to go and pursue Geronimo. And when they caught up with him, to negotiate with them as relatives to relatives and to convince his warriors to come in, because they knew Geronimo would not give up himself. And so the relative scouts convinced the warriors that they need to lay down their weapons. They told them that the women and children, their wives and children, already had been taken by train to a faraway place called Florida. And so the Apache warriors talked among themselves. But Geronimo told them, don't trust them. Don't trust whatever they say. They're speaking for the white people. He said, I know they're your relatives, but don't listen to them. But they didn't want to take a chance that their wives and their children were already being taken to a faraway land called Florida. And so they laid down their weapons. As they walked by Geronimo, they looked at him and he said, I'm not going to give up. But as he saw his warriors walking down with no weapons, Geronimo finally stood up and he realized he couldn't fight the battles alone. And so he got in line and followed his warriors. Later on in years, he said, I never should have given up. I should have fought to the end. But those scouts that successfully brought in Geronimo, the soldiers didn't bring him in. It was the relative scouts who convinced the group to come in. They came in and they brought him in. And later on, those scouts that successfully convinced the warriors to give in were given Congressional Medal of Honor, I think by President Cleveland. And they were proudly among the other soldiers. It was a Medal of Honor, of course. Finally, the time came Oh, then the soldiers, I mean, the warriors, when they came and realized that their women and children were still in San Carlos, they were not taken by train to Florida yet. They were deceived, but they were all put in chains. And when they were being brought back from the mountains, General Nelson Miles told his lieutenants and captains, you know what the Apaches do when there's a gunfire to show that they're not involved with that gunfire at all. They run to the center of the corral to show that they're not involved. They raise their hands up. Give a false alarm and shoot a few rounds off, but put soldiers around there and hide them. When they're in the center, take them all prisoner. And so while Geronimo and his men were being brought in before they arrived at San Carlos, few rounds were shot off, and all the Apaches ran to the center of the corral. And then they realized they were deceived, and they were all taken prisoner. And so Geronimo finally was brought in, put in chains. He gave his rifle to the commanding officer. And he was put in chains, and later he was loaded up on a buckboard. As he and his warriors started leaving San Carlos, the military band struck a tune of Auld Lang Syne. And all of the other Chiricahuas were also rounded up, and they were told to follow the buckboards. And they were taken all the way to the train tracks at Holbrook, Arizona. And they were loaded up on trains there. And then they started heading east. But before the train left, those Apache scouts that brought them in also were escorting them to the train at Holbrook. They were wearing the Congressional Medals of Honor. But as soon as all the Apaches were put on the trains, the captain walked up to them and said, give me your firearm, give me your sidearm, give me your knife, and take off that jacket, and take off your red headbands. They were stripped of any identification that they were Apache military scouts or the cavalry. With a surprised look on their faces, they took their clothes off and gave their weapons to the soldiers. And then they were told to get up on the train, the very train where they had just taken the captives they had brought in, and they were locked in the same train with the Apache warriors they had fought just not long ago. There's a story that says that they stopped at San Antonio to take a break for the soldiers while the train was getting ready to move again. There's an Apache song that says that the Apache scouts sang, and they took off their medals. They rolled up the ribbon, and all the Apache scouts, they threw the medals out to the side of the railroad. They say to this day, somewhere along railroad tracks, somewhere before or after San Antonio, somewhere in the dirt lies Congressional Medals of Honor. To the Apache scouts, it had no meaning whatsoever, because they were deceived and made POWs in bringing in the Apache warriors, Geronimo's last warriors. And so these people were taken all the way to Alabama, to Mount Vernon barracks, where the men were unloaded. But the women stayed on with the children and the older men, elders, and they were taken to St. Augustine, Florida. And there they were unloaded at Fort Marion, right against the water. The water laps against the outside of the building. It is very damp, very wet inside. There's mold and mildew everywhere. And to put a desert people in that environment, many started dying of tuberculosis right away. My wife and I were asked to do some Apache dances there one time at a festival. So during our break, we drove to Fort Marion, and we asked the park ranger to show us where the Apache stayed, because I'm Apache. She said, I have something to share with you. No one knows what this is. Can I take you there? I said, sure. So she took us to this fort, and it was a very small fort. The inside was real small. I thought movies show it as real big parade grounds, but these were really small. I looked up on top and I looked down below, and I said, they stayed here all those years here in this little area next to the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean right there. And she said, here, come down this way. So we went from the top of the fort, down some stairs, and went down below. It was real thick with moisture. And she turned on her flashlight and she said, this is where some of them were kept. She said, there's a drawing right here. Can you tell me what that is? And she shined a light on the brick. And some Apache from long ago had etched an image. And I looked at that and I said to my wife, I said, do you know what that is? She goes, yes, I do. I said, that's a mountain spirit dancer. That's our Argon, the guardians of the four mountains. And we felt really sad that even in this dark room in the basement of a fort on the other side of the country, against a great body of water, these desert mountain people were still trying to stay close to home by etching in the images of our sacred dancers. I touched that etching and I just said a prayer. Then my wife and I looked around one more time and we saw how small and dark it was in that area where they were kept. And we went up to the top and finally could feel the sun, and there was still moisture in the air, but not as bad as down below. And I thought, oh, what these people had gone through. And then she goes on and says, you know, they had a ceremony here one time in the center. They said a girl came of age to become a woman. And somehow they were able to have a 4-day ceremony here. All the soldiers lined up on top and watched. And were allowed to build a bonfire in the middle. And they somehow created these dancers with masks. With what little they had a 4-day ceremony. And I thought to myself, how in the world would these prisoners of war be able to find material to do the 4-day Apache sunrise dance, the puberty rites ceremony of all the Apache girls? When they have a menstrual flow, a year later, they have that ceremony. And somehow they were able to do that. My wife is a godmother for 3 Apache girls that went through the ceremony. Our daughter went through that ceremony. And 3 of our granddaughters went through that ceremony. We're having the same ceremony again during Easter weekend up in the mountains, just before you get into Salt River Canyon, in that forested area on the east side of the US 60. And so we still carry on that tradition. But to think that as prisoners of war, these families still thought enough of that little girl to make her become a woman. And I thought, where did they find the buckskin? Where did they find the eagle feathers? Where did they find the sacred yellow cattail pollen? Where did they find the material to make drums? All that they had to suffer because they were displaced. Finally, sometime along the line, they were allowed to come back. And they got back on a train and they were brought back this way. But when they got to Oklahoma, they realized that Arizona citizens were protesting to their politicians, saying that they don't want the Apaches to come back to Arizona. So they got stuck in Oklahoma. And through the generosity of the Kiowa people there, the Kiowas had just received excess land, an old military base called Fort Sill. And it was excess land, and they said, you can live there if you want. It's extra land. So the Apaches, some of them were unloaded there. They chose to stay with the Kiowas in Oklahoma. And there, a lot of Apaches still live, the Fort Sill Apaches. And the rest of them wanted to keep going further. And they were allowed by their brothers and sisters from the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico, by Rio Doso, New Mexico, to live on that mountain peak there. So most of Cochise's people, many of Geronimo's people, all live in New Mexico on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. But none of them made it back here to Arizona because the citizens protested them of their return. But another thing that Apaches suffered too was when we were kept as prisoners of war. All of the other reservations in the US were reservations, with the exception of San Carlos. San Carlos was not a reservation. It was a prisoner of war camp. He might talk a little bit about that later on, because his people were forced to move to San Carlos. Yavapais are our closest allies in battle. And so they were mistaken as Apaches, and they were forced to come to San Carlos as well. So all of the Apaches that resisted placement to the reservations and wanted to retain their freedom were forcibly taken to San Carlos, to my reservation. While we were there, we were stricken of our names because many of the names of the men were heroic deeds that they were known for. So when the people referred to them, it gave them a status of honor, accomplishment, and the military did not want that. So they gave us necklaces with a letter, dash, and a number. And I always tell people, I say, my great-great-grandfather was R2D2. You have to have a sense of humor about this. But so we had no identity as men back then. We had metal tags that had a letter, dash, and a number. I want to thank all the women in here for what the women did back then. A New York Women's Society somehow found out that the Apaches were stricken of their identities in the POW camp in San Carlos, Arizona. So they gathered enough funds to take a train all the way from New York to come here to San Carlos. And they toured San Carlos, and they saw for themselves that indeed the Apache men were wearing metal tags that had letters and numbers. And because of their protesting, that policy was changed. Either give them back their names or give them a name of some sort. My name is Kenneth Duncan Sr. When my great-great-grandfather walked up to the table where they were giving out names, they couldn't pronounce my family name. So they went down the military roster. And there was a young soldier there with a Scottish name, last name Duncan. So I was given the name Duncan. So my identity is somewhat lost in translation. And so I bear the name of a soldier that was stationed in San Carlos. But you know, life is ironic. My wife and I have 7 sons and 1 daughter, so I always had to look in the baby name books. I found out that Kenneth means handsome. And in Scottish, Duncan means brown warrior. Yeah, so my dad knew what he was talking about. But it was interesting, as I just always remembered that somehow. But our names were lost. we were stricken of our identity. And so a lot of these things happened to me growing up. But now I'm very proud of who I am. I'm proud to be Apache. And I feel bad for the people that got taken off the reservation. They didn't have a grandmother that fought hard, tooth and nail, like ours did. My grandmother Mary. I always think he is Janan. Still, one of his Kari. Uta aini niga ndenchli niku. Da ndega is tita ndega wapan sha. Ndega matsus chaos ndega ste. Niku niwa niku. So I always think my grandmother allowed me to be Apache. And there were a lot of different things that took place. There were things. Do you have your reading glasses, Mom? I left my reading glasses in the car. I told my wife, I said, I'm never early for anything. I come fashionably late. She says, not this time. So she dragged me out of the car and I left my reading glasses. But things changed. Indian boarding schools were really bad in the 1800s. Children were forced from their parents' arms, and they were forcibly taken to Indian boarding schools, and they were told not to speak their language. And they were told not to dress the same way. Their hair was cut too. Their hair was cut to make it short and to assimilate into mainstream society. But where my wife and I went, it was in the mid-70s, so life had changed back then, thanks to some policies that were put in place. There was an act that was initiated to address the mass transfer of Native children out of Native communities, because a lot of these children, besides being taken out of their homes to be put in boarding schools to assimilate, a lot of children also, as that social worker was trying to do with us, would put us in non-Native homes, in non-Native communities. And so after realizing that this was something that shouldn't be done, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978. And this act was to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families by establishment of minimum federal standards for the removal of Indian children and placement of such children in homes which will reflect the unique values of Indian culture. And so this was something that took place before I became an adult. And so I'm very happy that all these things have taken place. But as an Apache, I just want to share what it's like to not have suffered that type of genocide. Apache people were severely punished. On my reservation, San Carlos, it's a place where Apaches did not live. It's an arid land. If you look at an Apache ceremony, you'll see the women are wearing knee-high, thick moccasins, the moccasin boots, and their dress is thick deerskin skirts and thick deerskin ponchos, and the men wore thick elkskin jackets and thick elkskin hats with eagle feathers adorned to it. People that live in the desert would not wear such thick deer and elkskin clothing. And so we were put in San Carlos, but that is home for me now because that's where we buried our dead. Old San Carlos, where the original POW camp, where Geronimo and Victorio were kept, is underwater now under the San Carlos Lake. So they covered the whole cemetery in concrete. We could have gone back up to the mountains, because we're given the choice. But because our dead were buried there, we chose not to wander far. So we wandered 15 miles upriver, and that's where we live to this day, San Carlos. But San Carlos was a huge reservation. They gave us a land that was inhospitable, very arid. But then the white people realized that there was silver along the edges on the south side and copper. So they moved the reservation in 20 miles. And now there are towns called Mammoth, San Manuel, Winkleman, Kearney, Hayden, all mining towns. And then on the western side, they moved the reservation from just this side of Superior all the way down to where our reservation line is just on the other side of Globe. And there are mining towns there, Globe, Claypool, Miami, and of course Superior. All those used to be on our reservation. And then to the east, there's Clifton and another town called Morenci. They are still mining copper there. And so it's ironic when you look at a map. Our reservation is right here, but right on the fringes of the reservation are about 12, 15 copper and silver mines. So it happened to us again. We don't reap the benefits of the minerals that were once in our land. Somehow the reservation lines were moved in. And that's where I come from, San Carlos Apache tribe. And I thank my grandmother in allowing me to be here. I thank my grandmother in teaching me how to cope with poverty. My grandfather made money by being a medicine man. Most of the time he got paid in goods by food. He got paid a little bit of cash, but mostly in goods. And that's how we ate. My grandmother was able to get groceries by making cradle boards to sell at the nearby trading posts. And so that's how we survived. But my grandmother, she raised us the best way she could. I can still hear her singing while she made cradle boards. We would be playing. I see my grandmother sitting underneath the shade of the tree, and she would have her blanket out in her cloth Apache camp dress with her hair pulled back, and she'd be whittling away at another piece of a cradle board. And she would be singing that song. And then I would go meet my brothers and sister again as I listened to her finish her song, Apache lullaby song. She would whisper to herself as she whittled away another cradle board. And so I share with you my life as someone that was somewhat spared effects of what they call genocide. A lot of my friends know nothing about being Apache. Now I teach Apache to my own people. Every Monday I drive down to San Carlos with my wife and son, right there, Kevin. And the three of us teach our Apache people our traditional stories. I talk about our ceremonies. I talk about how to count to 10, how to say hello, introduce themselves as I did traditionally earlier. I teach them the basics in being Apache. And we do native Apache arts and crafts every now and then. And so, thanks to my grandmother in sparing me being taken off the reservation, I've now become a resource person for my own tribe. I'm very blessed, very happy to do that. It's an honor for me to do that. The boogie woman never got me, thanks to my grandmother. I met my wife. We got married. And we moved to Phoenix after she graduated from ASU here. And we had 3 children and a 4th one on the way, living on Thomas and maybe 11th Street, something like that. And after I got off work, my wife goes, I haven't gone ice skating in a while. I want to show the kids how to ice skate. I said, okay. So we had our supper. After supper, we changed clothes and we loaded our 3 little kids in a car and we drove to what used to be called Tower Plaza. If you remember where Tower Plaza is, I think it's 30-something Street and Thomas or McDowell, one of those. But it used to be a mall and there was an ice rink in there. And I don't ice skate, but my wife grew up ice skating, being from cold country. So she took the kids in there, put little ice skates on them, and she helped them around, and they were going around. And I was sitting with the littlest one, Tony, and I was watching him, and we watched my wife take the 2 little kids, my oldest son and our daughter, in our arms and skate. And
sorry. No, sorry.
And then they got done and they took off their skates, got back in their regular shoes, and we started walking out. And then my littlest one started running, Tony. So I chased him a little bit, and my wife was bringing the other 2 kids in from the rink. So it's a big corridor. And I sat on a metal bench right here. I said, let's wait for Mom and Dad, come on. And I sat down with him, but as he always was, being ever energetic, he popped off of the bench and he took off. And running around, laughing. All of a sudden, the door opened on the side. A young woman, dark hair, opened the door. And he says, come on, Mom, I'll hold the door for you. And an old lady with a cane walked out. White hair with little hints of blonde, glasses, and her lips bright red. Old woman, hunched over. As she was walking with the help of her daughter. She stopped and smiled. She goes, oh, cute little boy. And I smiled. I said, thank you. And she looked at me. She said, is that your boy? And I said, yes. And then something smacked me in the face. It was Mrs. Stickney, the social worker in my childhood. She was standing right there in front of my son. And chills went down my back, like goosebumps on my arms. That fear that I felt when I was a little boy, avoiding that woman, was standing right in front of my son. Old lady, all that fear came back to me. She's the one that wanted to take me away from my grandmother. She's the one that wanted to take me away from my grandfather. My life had come full circle. I went over there and I took my son. I said, yes, he's my son. Have a good day. And I held my son. And her daughter held her up. And they slowly walked out. And as they're walking out, I told my wife when she came up, she goes, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What happened?" "What did she say?" I said, "Nothing bad." She said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Look at her. Remember my stories about my boogie woman, the one that we were afraid of all those years as children? That's her right there. That's Mrs. Stickney." She goes, "Ah, is that really her?" She looked and looked, and she was being led outside of Tower Plaza by her daughter, walking with a cane. She goes, "Oh my gosh." And that's how my childhood came back to me all at once when I saw that woman. Just imagine how other children felt in seeing people that took them from their homes that they met maybe later on. But that's my story, my life story as an Apache child. But my grandmother made me who I am. I've had the chance to meet a few US presidents and sing them songs and play the flute for them. Thanks to my grandmother. I was asked to be in the opening ceremonies at the London Summer Olympics because of what I did for that event, using my grandfather's ceremony. And I said, "Thank you, grandfather, in teaching me how to speak to the rain," how the Olympic people asked me to help them. And so I owe a lot to my grandparents. And the last thing I did was when I was asked to come to the Basilica at the Vatican. The Pope left his canopy with all the cardinals and the nuns back there. And all the people were gathered in mass outside St. Peter's Basilica. He came walking. And then the gentleman that was handling me at the time, my agent, said, Ken, do you have a drum?" I said, "Yes, I do." He says, "When the Pope gets close, sing him a song. Sing him a song." And so I took my drum as the Pope came walking up to me. I remember my grandfather's song. "In prayer, I walk in prayer." Shiukai begunasha, shiukai begunasha, begunasha away ne, shiukai begunasha away. And the Pope smiled at me, shook my hand, and then he reached in his pocket and he gave me a rosary. Still have to this day. And I said, "Thank you, grandfather, for teaching me that song." And so that is my life story as an Apache. And ever since then, I've started trying to learn as much as I can about my Apache people. And I am proud to be who I am. Somebody asked me, if you could be anything else, what would you be? And it's real simple. I'd rather be who I am. The Creator made me who I am. I want Apache to be my first language. Inde gaurawa noji yarishti. Tunda nikaya chalmana nakisin shtira. Inde shti. I do not want to be anyone else or anything else. I do not want to be a white person, a Hispanic, an Asian, or a Black person. I am who I am. I'm proud of who I am. Why? Because the Creator told me this is who you're going to be. And I never questioned what He does. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and joining me for my lecture. I hope that I was able to inspire you to look further into your own families to see what your grandparents, great-grandparents did for your family. This is what my grandmother, what my grandfather did for me. Thank you very much.
Under fields of questions.
Yeah.
And before we get to the Q&A, you would have any kind of conversation around anything.
Yeah, do you have any
Yeah,
questions about what I covered before? Yeah. Is that what you were asking?
Whatever format you want, but.
Yeah. Did you have any questions on what I spoke on, or was everything okay? Everything cool?
Oh, yeah, you can sit down if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had a question?
I was just curious about how much Apache language is still spoken.
That's a good question. When I entered the school system as a Head Start, I went to the Peridot Lutheran Mission School, and I had an Apache teacher. And then in the kindergarten, I had a Lutheran missionary who became fluent in Apache. And first grade is when we started making the transition from Apache to English. We only spoke Apache, the whole classroom, 30 of us, we only spoke Apache at the time. So we were taught English by Lutheran missionaries. They still run that school too, by the way. And so now when I walk into a classroom, maybe children-wise, this is just elementary school kids, maybe out of 30, maybe about 5 of them speak Apache. But for adults my age, between 30 and maybe 60, whatever, I'd say about 80% of us still speak the language. It's still pretty strong compared to most other tribes. Most other tribes, they rarely speak their language anymore. One of the reasons why my wife's father fell in love with me was because every time my father called to North Dakota when I was visiting, he said, "It's your dad, he wants to talk to you." And her dad would hear that my dad was calling from the reservation. All of a sudden, her dad, the old man, would come slowly walking in the hallway. He would take his sofa seat right there next to me, and he would lean and he would listen to me speak Apache. And so he really liked the fact that I would speak Apache, because on her reservation, their language is almost completely gone. So Apaches, Navajos, Hopis are the strongholds of Apache language in Arizona. A lot of the other tribes, I don't know, Yavapais.
It's a lot lower.
Yeah, a lot lower. So Apaches, Navajos, and Hopis are the stronghold in retaining their language. All the other tribes are really struggling. Anyone else?
Yes, thank you for sharing your spiritual traditions with us. I'm interested in the creation myth. The creation myth of the Apache, are they different from other creation myths of other tribes, or is it the same kind of variation on a theme?
As compared to other native tribes, every tribe has its own origin stories, and there's different stories. There's a migration story. There's a place of origin. Then there's a creation story.
Of the universe.
Yeah. All the Apache creation stories are pretty much the same. We share the same colors. But I know the Yavapais
It's totally different.
have 3 of our colors, but they have the color red in theirs. We don't have the color red in ours. So they are from the Pi people. So that we're very close, but we're 2 different people. But all the Apache creation stories are the same. It's a long story, but the simplified children version is what I shared with you. about the creation coming out of nothing, darkness, then creating the green and the blue, and then the first sunrise, yellow, and then his breath in the form of clouds. That's the basic children's creation story. But the original one talks about all the different sacred metals that are in the mountains: black metal, blue metal, yellow metal, white metal. All of those are in the story. So yeah, all of the tribes, the Chiricahua, the Western Apache, the Chiricahua, all those tribes, they share the same creation story.
The actual story would take days to tell. I mean, like you said, yeah, it would be over a series of tellings.
And are there human figures in the story or, you know?
Yeah. If you go to an Apache sunrise dance, the girl, as she's dancing, the singers are talking about the creation of the universe and how the first woman was created that began the Apache people. And that's a white painted woman. And so if you listen, and like he said, it takes 4 days to tell the story in song and in dance.
Each story too, like he was saying, there's a difference between Yavapai and Apaches. I'm both. I'm the J Apache, so we're Tonto Apache, but also Yavapai. And each one is going to have a land-based element. So it'll be situated in a specific place. So like Yavapai origin story is that we came out at Montezuma Well, where the well is now. There was no water and we were inside the earth and came out. But the Apache origin story is different. It relates to a different landscape. So each tribal nation, one of the major differences is going to be what place it's connected to, because there's always a land-based specific element. Or it might be that people came from the sky people, like northeastern tribes don't always come from within the earth. They come from sky people and are placed down on earth. So they're all very different.
Mm-hmm. Like there's one more of an earth-based origin that's in the very front waters of Oak Creek, where the Apache versus Apache woman was made. But then before they came to this area where they originally decided they were going to be Apaches, just like you said, the Star People, Apaches believed that we were brought here by an alien race from a planet behind Orion's belt. We came from a civilized and advanced race of aliens, and we were placed here, and we were told that there's going to come a time when the people that are in charge of this planet will forget how to take care of the planet, and they're going to almost destroy it. Your purpose is to be humble, to be meek, and to be the teachers to remind them how to take care of this planet. But they also told us we will not allow them to destroy this planet. When it almost seems like this planet is dying, we will come back from the planet and we will come and take charge, and we will remind everyone how they're supposed to take care of this planet. So one day, if this world keeps getting more polluted and this greenhouse effect keeps going, Apaches think that pretty soon the alien people are going to come back and take over again, because they're monitoring us right now. So there's no question for us if there are UFOs. We are from the Star People. We're one of them.
I've got a couple questions to tie together some things that Doreen said on Monday and that came up in the conversation, and also something relating to Maurice's work and new project. The first one is with the Boogie Woman. Like we talked about structural racism and how it's ongoing. I've seen, documentaries like Our Hearts on the Ground that looks at the Dakotas and how children are still taken. Like this is a legacy of the boarding schools. So I know a little bit more about the Dakotas and how the rate that Native children are taken from their parents. Like this is a ongoing legacy of destruction. And I also wanted to raise a question or comment about, because it came up as well with the like, how do you go to military bases to perform when the US military has done what they've done to your people? And this came up in your words, Ken, and I know, Maurice, you're working on a project looking at the legacy of this. So just wanted to throw those two giant themes out there and questions and comments.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, sure.
So I have a story, a quick story that I want to tell. Ken mentioned the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed in 1978, the year that I was born. So it must have been a good year. The intent is to protect Native children from these high levels of being placed outside of tribal communities, outside of their own communities. So the ICWA has sort of like a tier of placement. First preference is given to social workers, when a child is taken into custody, they should be placed with their own tribal family members. And then the next is, if that's not possible, within the tribal community. And then the third is with other Native peoples. And then the last resort is with a non-Native family. That's how it's supposed to work. So I have a nephew that was, there were some family issues, and the child welfare authorities took him when he was a toddler, and they called available family that they could get in touch with, which was my wife, who was not a Native person. And the social worker, we had the baby with us, but the social worker had to come to our house. So the social worker came to our house, and I wasn't home at this time. I think I was traveling for work or at a conference or something. And the social worker, they come in your house and they look and they see, we had made a crib because he has my children who are the same age as him. So we had a place for him to sleep. We had a bed ready. They look in your cabinet to make sure you have food. I mean, they look around and they make sure everything's safe. But the social worker knew that this was a Native child, and he was obviously a Native, he has little, real straight black hair and full head of hair, but he was a baby. And the social worker, my wife told me this story because I wasn't there. What about your husband? And she said, oh, he's away. And she said, well, tell me about him. And he said, my wife said to him, the social worker, well, he's a tribal member, and et cetera, et cetera. And she said it was the most relieved she'd ever seen anyone become in that moment, when he realized, okay, this will satisfy ICWA. Basically, this will satisfy the demands of the law, that he's being placed with a family member who is a tribal member. And so those protections are in place. And I mean, it was just legislated again at the Supreme Court recently, within the last few years, with Brackeen, and it was upheld. There was a fear that it would be overturned. But these things are legislated and re-legislated and decided in court cases almost on a regular basis. There are challenges because they say that actually these protections are racist. People are making those arguments today continually. So, but I just wanted to share that story that I have experience in my own life. And we took care of our nephew for a time, but and then he went back to his family. But this is something we deal with on a regular basis. I mean, it comes up often.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that my wife and I are approached by these people that are called lost birds. And these lost birds are the ones that were put out in non-native communities. And they somehow make their way to my wife over there. She's like a magnet. All of a sudden I say, who are you talking to? There's some more lost birds. They want to talk to me. And so she seems to have something that makes them gravitate towards her. So she knows a lot of lost birds that are out there. They know nothing about being native, but they come from, we know two that come from the San Carlos Reservation, a guy and a lady, and they're always together, and they know nothing about being Apache. I really feel for them. They know they have a sense of belonging, but they, at the same time, they really don't belong. And so, yeah, so I'm glad that that law has been reinforced just recently. Anything else for either one of us? He's writing a book too. I want to hear
the
more about
army,
this book.
the military question.
That came up on Monday too.
Yeah.
Dorian.
Yeah. Do you have any feelings on that? Or people, I've been asked many times, because I have ancestors who are scouts, who served in the U.S. military, who helped chase down people like Geronimo. One of my great uncles was on that last Geronimo campaign in 85 and 86 and was part of a group actually that this is a fairly well-known story. There was a group of Apache scouts, one company, and they're in Mexico during this time. And there was officially supposed to be sort of like a relaxing of that border that the US military could pursue Geronimo's band in northern Mexico. But a group of Mexican militia attacked a scout company of Apache scouts because they thought that they were renegades, at least that's what they said. And the commander was killed. The white officer who's the main officer
Crawford
was killed. Crawford was shot, Emmett Crawford. And then, but that company was captured and then they were led to a Mexican village by the Mexican militia called San Buenaventura. And my ancestor was in that group that was captured. And he talked about, they were sort of paraded through the city and the Mexicans hated Apaches. And actually Apaches disliked the Mexicans as well, more than they disliked the Anglo-Americans in that area. But they were paraded through the town and sort of berated and they were held and they thought they were going to be killed. But then their release was negotiated not too long after that. And he went back home. And so the question is, you know, why would you do this? Why? Because the scouts were not conscripted, they were volunteers. They would go into the community and they would ask, okay, who will enlist? And they served typically short enlistments from 30 days to 6 months. And I have ancestors who served 5, 6, 7 enlistments that actually in their total, if you added them all up, they were longer than the standard enlistments of white enlisted soldiers. They were 5 to 6 years, whereas standard enlisted man served 3 years, 4 years, something like that. And so the question is often, why would you do that? Why would you chase down other Apaches? And there are a variety of reasons that are given. And the answer is, well, part of the answer is I don't know because I'm not them. I wasn't there. One of the most common answers is people like Geronimo, when they left San Carlos, made it harder for people who were at San Carlos. Because every time they would leave, then the agent and the army would clamp down harder on that community. And so the people in the community would then say, well, we'll help bring him in. And because they're our relatives, we'll try to do it in as quick and, you know, hopefully not bloodless manner possible. And then life will get easier for us here because we just want to sort of keep living. I mean, that's the main reason given. There's also the idea that scouts, because they were allowed, if you weren't a scout, you couldn't carry a firearm. You didn't have freedom of motion. Whereas scouts were allowed to sort of be in the field and continue a sort of approximation of a warrior way of life that maybe you had been living before that they got to be sort of free. They were on horseback, they had their weapons, and they were, you know, it was a sort of a continuation of a previous way of life. That's another reason that's given. And then there's a monetary aspect too. I mean, scouts were enlisted and received the same pay as white enlisted soldiers. They got to go to the commissary. They had access to supplies. One scout's salary could support an entire extended family at a time when the rest of the reservations living on rations that were commodities that were given out every day that were terrible quality, rotten meat. The scout got to go to the soldier's store and have good, you know, better food and better supplies. And then later in life, the part that I'm writing about is what happened to them when they were elderly. They all got pensions. They got military pensions. So you get and many of them lived into the 1920s and 30s. So imagine during the Depression, you're a former Army scout, you got a pension of $30 a month. That's a lot more than your average person was getting when the idea of a social safety net was just sort of developing, when things like Social Security are in their infancy. Well, a scout got a pension. And again, that could support an entire extended family at a time when life was really rough. But those are some of the reasons that are given. Honestly, though, I think each person would have a different reason, and it would be based on their own situation and their own feelings about it.
I think the main reason was to try to regain self-respect from their families, their wives, from the community, because like he said, they were stricken as men. So being a scout was a means of saving some kind of dignity as a man, because everything was stricken from them. And and it was better. They could draw rations from the commissary, and they were paid the same as he said as the other soldiers. And so they actually had a really good life. And they were given horses and ammo and everything. They could go hunting whenever they wanted to, where other warriors were not allowed to go anywhere. They could not have firearms. When I was growing up, as I said, my grandfather was a head medicine man. He was the main medicine man. So he had the pleasure of meeting different notable people in life. We went to the White Mountain Reservation one time, and we were driven to this house. It was a brick house. Most homes on a Fort Apache reservation are wooden. This was a brick house, and it had a chain link fence, and it even had a sidewalk going in there. I thought, wow, who lives here? And an old woman came out. He said, "Oh, Mary, Marshall, you're here." I said, "Yeah." I said, "We have your rooms ready for you. Your grandchildren are here?" "Yes." "Okay, we have their rooms too." I said, "Okay." So we went in there, and we put our stuff in there, our bundles of clothes. And my grandfather was a well-respected medicine chief. And so he was received very well in different places. So we tagged along with him. But finally, an old man comes out, and he said, "Hey, Marshall, good to see you here." They shake hands, "Have a seat," and we're talking. And then he says, "Hey, are these your grandchildren?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "This is the oldest right here. He's my apprentice. I'm teaching." He said, "Oh, really? Come here." He goes, "I'm a little boy." Comes over here. I go over there and I sit him. He's like, lifts me up, puts me on his lap. And I look at all of the military hardware up on the ceiling, on the walls, and the shelves. And I see a shield there, a cavalry jacket, and carbines over here, different carbines and different weapons. And I said, "What's that?" He goes, "Oh, that's my shield." He said, "What's over that?" "That's my rifle. I carried it and when I was an Apache scout." He said, "I was a sergeant." He says, "My name is William
I'll just say.
William Sargent." He said, "I am I'm the last surviving Apache scout." He said, "We didn't do any scouts." He said, "We were mostly in parades." He said, they dressed in their dress uniform. Apache scouts actually had their own dress uniform. They had, those epaulets and everything. And they had those helmets too, they're like pit helmets. They had their own ceremonial parade uniform, dress uniform, just like the Marines dress uniform. And their symbol was the cross of the arrows. That was their insignia for Apache scouts. And so he said, "Yeah, my name is William Major. My name is William Major. You should look him up." He said, he said, "I'll tell you stories more about what I did as an Apache scout." And so but years later, when I was in boarding school, my dad sent me a newspaper clip, opened it up, and I showed my wife. I said, "Hey, this old man, I sat on his lap." This at Tucson military base, Fort Huachuca, takes old cavalry cannons to Fort Apache and give the last surviving Apache scout a 7-gun salute to Sergeant William Major. And I actually sat on his lap when I was a little boy. What an honor.
Well, the last scouts weren't decommissioned until the 1940s.
Yeah.
I mean, long after the so-called Indian Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah. One last thing I want to say. Can I make one last comment?
You can make one last comment.
So when I'm thinking about this question of why serve, there's one thing that for us, for my group specifically, I think is maybe the biggest motivator. As Ken mentioned, they moved all Apaches and Yavapais to San Carlos, to one reservation, starting in 1875, and everybody was congregated in one place. And there was no freedom of movement. If you left, like old women trying to pick acorns outside of the reservation boundary, you could get shot. I mean, they could kill you, the army. And so think about guys who volunteered as scouts, where they were. Many of them were stationed at Fort Verde and Camp Verde. That's where we're from. So for 6 months at a time, you're allowed to be back in your homeland as a Apache man carrying a gun. being in the field, that motivation of being in your homeland, even if it was only for a time, I think was a really important motivator, that you got to be in the place where your grandparents were buried, where your ancestors were. I think that was maybe one of the most powerful motivators that I just kind of thought of again. Yeah.
Well, thank you to both of you, Ken, for sharing your story, and very powerful. And Maurice, thank you for sharing your expertise and some of your story as well. We're going to take an approximately, well, I think we could do a little bit more than 5 minutes, maybe about a 7-minute break, just so people can use the restroom, have coffee.